I was wrong about exercise. For most of my adult life, if you'd asked me what actually keeps a person healthy long-term, I would have told you, without hesitation, that it was cardio. Running, cycling, getting your heart rate up, protecting your heart, because heart disease is the thing that kills most people, so surely the thing that protects you from it is the thing that matters most. I built an entire mental model of health around that one idea. And after spending years talking to exercise scientists, geriatricians, and researchers who study aging at the cellular level, I've had to admit I had it wrong, or at least dangerously incomplete. Strength is what actually keeps you alive, not instead of cardio, but in a way that changes the entire order of priority. I used to carry around in my head without ever really questioning it. I want to take my time with this one, because unlearning something you've believed your whole life deserves more than a quick correction. And I think walking through exactly how my mind changed, piece by piece, will do more for you than simply being handed the conclusion. The first conversation that cracked it open was with an exercise physiologist who, almost as an aside, mentioned something that stopped me completely. She said that after your 30s, without any deliberate intervention, the average adult starts losing a measurable percentage of their muscle mass every single decade, a process with an actual clinical name, sarcopenia, and that this loss quietly accelerates the further you move into your 50s, 60s, and beyond. I remember sitting there slightly stunned, because I realized I had never once, in my entire life, heard this framed as something worth paying attention to starting in your 30s. I'd heard endless messaging about cardiovascular health starting young. I had never heard anyone tell me, at 30, that a slow, invisible erosion of my muscle tissue was already quietly underway, and that ignoring it wasn't neutral. It was accumulating a cost I wouldn't feel the size of for decades. That single fact sent me looking for more, and what I found, conversation after conversation, was a consistent theme that ran directly against everything I'd assumed about the hierarchy of what actually matters for a long, healthy life. Let me tell you about the moment I actually understood why muscle mattered this much, because it wasn't really about looking a certain way, which is what I'd always subconsciously associated strength training with. A geriatrician described something to me that reframed the entire subject. She said that one of the strongest predictors she has, in her own clinical experience and backed by a large body of research, of whether an older adult will remain independent, able to live in their own home, get up from a chair without help, recover from an illness or a fall, isn't cardiovascular fitness at all. It's grip strength and lower body strength. She said something I haven't been able to forget since. The simple ability to get up off the floor without using your hands, something most of us do without a second thought in our 20s, becomes, later in life, a genuine, measurable predictor of mortality risk, specifically because it reflects the underlying strength and muscle reserve that so much of independent living quietly depends on. I had spent years worrying about my resting heart rate. I had never once thought about whether I could get up off the floor unassisted as a health marker worth tracking. I want to walk through the specific mechanisms that were explained to me, because understanding why muscle matters this much did more to change my behavior than simply being told that it does. The first mechanism is metabolic, and it genuinely surprised me. Muscle tissue functions almost like a sponge for glucose, the sugar from the food you eat, pulling it out of your bloodstream and putting it to use. The more muscle mass you carry, generally speaking, the better your body tends to be at managing blood sugar and insulin sensitivity. As muscle mass quietly declines with age, that sponge shrinks, and several researchers connected this directly to the rising rates of insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes that show up later in life, a connection that gets almost no attention compared to the endless conversation about diet alone. The second mechanism is skeletal, and it's the one that made me think differently about a family member of mine. Bone density and muscle mass are deeply linked, because the mechanical stress placed on bone during resistance exercise is one of the primary signals your body uses to maintain, and in some cases actually rebuild, bone density over time. Researchers were clear that this dual benefit, protecting muscle and bone simultaneously, is particularly critical for women after menopause, when bone density decline can accelerate sharply, and that resistance training is one of the few interventions genuinely shown to counteract that specific accelerated risk. The third mechanism reframed how I think about illness entirely. Several researchers described muscle tissue as functioning like a protein and metabolic reserve your body draws on during any period of serious physical stress, illness, surgery, recovery from injury. Someone entering a hospital stay with a larger reserve of muscle mass tends to show measurably better outcomes and faster recovery than someone entering that same illness with almost nothing in reserve. One physician put it in a way that stuck with me. Muscle mass is essentially a bank account you're drawing from during any period of serious physical stress, and an enormous number of people are entering their 60s, 70s, and 80s with an account that's nearly empty without ever having been told that account existed. The fourth mechanism is the one with the most direct data behind it, and it's the piece that finally completely dismantled my old cardio-first hierarchy. Multiple large, long-term population studies have found a consistent, strong relationship between measures of muscular strength, grip strength in particular, and overall mortality risk, independent of cardiovascular fitness. That word independent is the one that mattered most to me. It means strength appears to be predicting something real about your overall resilience that isn't simply explained away by whether you also do cardio. Researchers describe this as one of the most consistently replicated findings in the entire field of aging research, and simultaneously one of the least discussed in ordinary, mainstream health conversations, which remain almost entirely centered on cardiovascular exercise and diet, exactly the hierarchy I'd unknowingly absorbed and never questioned. There's a fifth mechanism I hadn't expected at all, and it's the one that made this feel personal in a completely different way. Several researchers described a growing body of evidence around what are sometimes called myokines, signaling molecules released directly by contracting muscle tissue during resistance exercise, which appear to travel through the bloodstream and interact with other organs, including the brain. Multiple researchers described this as one of the more genuinely exciting frontiers in the field, with early but consistent evidence linking regular strength training to measurable improvements in cognitive function and a reduced risk of cognitive decline in older age, through a pathway that has nothing to do with cardiovascular fitness at all. One neuroscientist described muscle, in light of this research, as functioning almost like an endocrine organ in its own right, actively communicating with your brain every time you lift something heavy, rather than simply being a passive structure that moves your skeleton around. I'd spent years assuming cardio was the exercise that mattered for my brain, given how much attention blood flow and cardiovascular health get in conversations about cognitive aging. I hadn't considered that the muscle itself might be sending its own independent signal. I also learned something about hormones that reframed how I think about fatigue and mood as I get older, which is the sixth mechanism worth mentioning. Resistance training has a well-documented effect on the regulation of hormones like testosterone and growth hormone in both men and women, hormones that naturally decline with age and that play a meaningful role in energy, mood, and the maintenance of muscle and bone tissue itself. Several researchers described a kind of reinforcing cycle here, where strength training helps support healthier hormonal regulation, which in turn supports the body's ability to maintain the very muscle mass being built, creating a compounding benefit over time that simply doesn't exist in the same way with cardiovascular exercise alone. I want to be honest about why I think I had this wrong for so long, because I think the reasons are worth naming, since I suspect they apply to a lot of people watching this too. Cardiovascular exercise has decades of public health messaging behind it, tied to heart disease research that's been building for generations, giving it an enormous head start in shaping how ordinary people think about exercise. Strength training, meanwhile, carried a cultural association I absorbed without ever examining it, tied to bodybuilders, athletes, gym culture, something that felt like it belonged to a specific kind of person, rather than something relevant to an ordinary adult simply trying to stay healthy. And a genuinely significant portion of the research connecting muscle mass directly to long-term mortality and independence is relatively recent compared to the much older body of cardiovascular research. Most public health messaging is still built around, I wasn't wrong because I was careless. I was wrong because I'd absorbed a hierarchy that public health messaging simply hadn't caught up on yet. I want to spend some time directly correcting a few specific myths I used to believe, because I suspect they're standing between a lot of people and this exact shift in thinking, the way they stood between me and it for years. The first myth is that strength training will make you bulky, especially a concern I've heard from women specifically. Several exercise physiologists were direct about this. Significant muscle bulk requires a very specific, deliberate combination of training, volume, intensity, And for most people, hormonal profiles that the average person, especially the average woman, simply doesn't have without pursuing it very deliberately and specifically. What ordinary, consistent strength training actually produces for the overwhelming majority of people is exactly the kind of lean, functional strength I've been describing throughout this entire conversation, not the specific, exaggerated aesthetic some people fear. The second myth is that strength training is dangerous for older adults, more likely to cause injury than to prevent one. Multiple geriatricians push back on this directly, and I thought quite forcefully. Properly supervised, appropriately scaled resistance training has an excellent safety record across even very elderly populations, and several researchers pointed out that the actual danger runs in the opposite direction. It's the ongoing muscle loss and weakness from not training that dramatically increases the risk of falls, fractures, and the kind of injuries that lead to a serious, often irreversible decline in independence. The fear of injury from lifting something heavy, several researchers argued, has quietly prevented far more injury and disability than it's ever prevented by keeping people away from the exact intervention that would have protected them. The third myth, one I held on to for longer than I'd like to admit, is that you need a serious commitment to heavy lifting, specialized gym equipment, or something close to a bodybuilder's routine to get any real benefit at all, and that assumption alone was enough to quietly keep me away from strength training for years, telling myself I'd get to it eventually, once I had more time or a proper setup. What the actual research shows, according to multiple physiologists I spoke with, is that even relatively modest amounts of resistance training, done consistently, 2 to 3 sessions a week, using bodyweight resistance bands or moderate weights, produce significant, measurable improvements in strength, muscle mass, and every one of the mechanisms I've just described. The threshold for meaningful benefit is considerably lower than I ever assumed. The barrier standing between most of us and this specific health benefit isn't really about capacity or equipment. It's almost entirely about awareness and a hierarchy of priorities that, in my case at least, was simply wrong. I remember one conversation specifically that made all of this feel less like an abstract correction and more like something urgent. I was speaking with a physiologist who works almost exclusively with older adults, and she described a pattern she sees constantly. People arrive at her clinic in their 60s or 70s, often after a fall, or after noticing they can no longer easily get up from a low chair or carry groceries up a flight of stairs. And they treat this decline as simply an inevitable feature of getting older, something to be managed rather than something that could have been different. She said the thing she finds most frustrating, and most genuinely hopeful at the same time, is that in the vast majority of these cases, a substantial share of that decline isn't actually an unavoidable feature of aging at all. It's the accumulated cost of decades spent almost completely neglecting one specific tissue, skeletal muscle, and that tissue responds, often remarkably well, even when strength training is introduced for the very first time much later in life. She described patients in their 70s and 80s regaining enough strength and function after a structured program to return to activities they had assumed were permanently gone. I sat with that for a long time afterward, because it meant the decline I'd always assumed was simply the natural, unavoidable shape of getting older was, in a meaningful number of cases, actually a story about neglect, not inevitability. I want to be careful not to overstate this into a claim that starting later completely erases decades of decline, because that wouldn't be honest either. What researchers were consistently clear about is something more precise, and I think more genuinely useful. The earlier you start building and maintaining muscle mass, the larger the reserve you carry into older age. But meaningful, measurable benefit from strength training remains available at essentially any age, including very advanced age, which makes it almost uniquely valuable compared to some other health interventions that show sharply diminishing returns the later in life you begin them. I also want to bring in something that genuinely alarmed me, because it touches something extremely common right now. Several researchers described a specific concern connected to a form of weight loss that's become enormously popular in recent years, achieved primarily through significant calorie restriction or newer weight loss medications without any deliberate strength training alongside it. A meaningful share of the weight loss through these methods, if not paired with resistance training, can come from muscle tissue rather than exclusively from fat, meaning someone can end up lighter on a scale while simultaneously ending up with a smaller, weaker muscular reserve than before, exactly the opposite of what's protective for long-term health. Several researchers were emphatic that this is an increasingly urgent, under-discussed concern, given how quickly these newer weight loss approaches have grown in popularity, and that anyone pursuing meaningful weight loss through any method should be pairing it deliberately with strength training, specifically to protect the muscle mass, otherwise at real risk alongside the fat. I want to bring everything together now, because I think there's a single idea underneath all of it that finally replaced the old hierarchy I used to carry around. We've spent decades treating muscle, strength, and the simple act of regularly lifting something heavy as a lifestyle choice relevant mainly to people who enjoy that kind of exercise, something optional, secondary, decorative. What the actual science overwhelmingly suggests is that maintaining muscle mass and strength is closer to a foundational, universal requirement for long-term health and independence, on par with, and in some specific, well-documented ways, more predictive than the cardiovascular exercise I used to place first without ever questioning it. So let me tell you what I've actually changed in my own life, and what I'd suggest you consider changing too, because I don't want to leave you with just a correction and no direction. First, if strength training isn't currently part of your routine, treat starting it, even in a small, modest way, as at least as high a priority as anything else you're currently doing for your health, rather than as an optional extra you'll get to eventually. 2 to 3 sessions a week, working the major muscle groups with whatever equipment or resistance is realistically accessible to you, is enough to begin producing real, measurable benefit. Second, if you're currently losing weight through calorie restriction or medication, make resistance training a deliberate, non-negotiable part of that process, specifically to protect your muscle mass while you lose fat, rather than treating exercises separate from the weight loss itself. Third, if you're already in your later years, or supporting a parent or older relative who is, stop assuming that declining strength and mobility is simply an unavoidable, unchangeable feature of aging. Meaningful improvement remains genuinely possible at essentially any age, and the earlier a structured strength program begins, even late in life, the more function and independence it tends to help preserve or restore. Fourth, pay attention to functional strength specifically, not just how you look or an abstract number on a barbell. Being able to comfortably get up from the floor, carry your own groceries, climb stairs without strain, these are the actual, practical markers that research has pointed to as most predictive of long-term independence. Fifth, if you're already doing cardiovascular exercise regularly and assumed, the way I used to, that this alone had your bases covered, understand that it isn't a substitute for strength training. The two protect against genuinely different things, and ideally both belong in a well-rounded routine, with neither one replacing the other. Sixth, let go of the specific fears that may have been quietly keeping you away from this, the way they kept me away for years. You're extremely unlikely to accidentally become bulky. Properly scaled resistance training is safe at essentially any age, including advanced age, when approached sensibly. And you don't need a serious gym setup or a bodybuilder's program to get real, measurable benefit. Seventh, if you have older parents or relatives, consider raising this with them directly, gently, as something worth exploring with their own doctor or a qualified trainer, rather than assuming their declining strength is simply something to be managed rather than something that could genuinely still be improved. I want to end with something the same geriatrician said to me, right near the end of our conversation, that has genuinely changed how I think about my own exercise habits since. She said, "We've built an entire culture around chasing extra years of life, treating longevity as a single headline number to maximize, while paying comparatively little attention to whether those extra years are actually independent, mobile, genuinely livable years, rather than years spent increasingly reliant on other people for basic tasks." She said if she had to name the single most underappreciated lever available for making sure those extra years are actually good ones, it wouldn't be a supplement or a specific diet or any of the things that dominate most conversations about longevity. It would be the simple, unglamorous act of regularly asking your muscles to do something hard, consistently, for the rest of your life, starting now, regardless of your current age. I spent years getting the hierarchy backwards. I don't intend to spend the next several decades making the same mistake.